Attention, all you druggos and those about to be on drugs. You are now entering a realm where up is down, left is right, right is wrong, 2 + 2 = 5, and little boy blue's a big girl now. Welcome back to the second part of our first 2-part episode of Archives of Atrocity. Just like I was yesterday, I'm your main man, John Adams, and with me as always is my co-host, podcast mascot, and the Scooby to my Shaggy, Chatto. When we last left the land of the pharaohs, the pharaoh was on the banks of the Nile, clutching his royal scepter, about to unleash a load of penis colada into the Nile. And given that there were female pharaohs throughout history, I'm really not sure how that would work for them. I just really hope they were all squirters. But back to ancient Egypt, if you will. In his lifetime, Amenhotep III had established the Aten as an independent cult. And although he took the Aten for his personal deity, it was never worshipped to the exclusion of any of the other gods. As far as we can tell, during the first couple of years of his reign, young Amenhotep IV was still devoted to the traditional gods. A carved scene from the tomb of a high-ranking official named Keruef shows the new king making offerings to both Amun and Ra-Hurakti under the watchful gaze of his mother, as opposed to Nefertiti, to whom he may not have been married yet. An inscription dated to year 1 of his reign from the sandstone quarry of Gebel el-Silsileh, south of Luxor, shows his first building project, which was a temple. A particular inscription reads, Ra-Hurakti, who rejoices in the horizon in his name of Shu, which is in the Aten in Karnak. And if you thought that sounded wanky, just you wait. It should also be mentioned that no earlier recording of the sun god had given him such a lengthy title. This particular temple was destroyed after his reign, and the blocks used for other construction projects. But as it was built with smaller sandstone blocks called talatat, these are easily identifiable to Egyptologists. Some of those talatat blocks remain visible in the 10th pylon, or gateway, at the temple complex of Karnak to this very day. So needless to say, the young pharaoh loved himself some Aten. In 1925, French Egyptologists at the Karnak temple discovered strange demolished statues uncovered outside the eastern wall of the temple complex, as they were excavating a drainage canal. The statues depicted the young pharaoh and talatat blocks laid nearby, but work was abandoned until 1975. Between the northwest and southwest corners, an avenue of statues continued west, possibly towards one or more temples. Blocks that had the inscription of Amenhotep IV were erased and replaced with the name Akhenaten. The project was thought to have been completed around the 4th or 5th year of the pharaoh's reign. The images of other gods were also expunged, as was the word Netjeru, the plural of the gods. Unusually around this time, a royal jubilee was celebrated. A royal jubilee was typically celebrated in the 30th year of a pharaoh's reign. The festival was thought to renew the pharaoh's kingship. The Jubilee may have very well been why the temple was constructed in the first place. The Jubilee also may have signified that the Aten had replaced Amun-Ra as the ruler of the gods. Between the 2nd and 4th years of his reign, the pharaoh had built at least 4 temples to the Aten in Karnak. And if that weren't enough, the pharaoh composed this particularly wanky piece of poetry. And no disrespect to any poetry enthusiasts out there, but if you're like me, you find poetry kind of wanky already. And this particular example has an extra smeggy, crusty layer of wank over it. So I'm gonna need a little bit of help to make it palatable for all of you. And fortunately, I got the homie DJ Bum Splitter here to help me out. Yo, Bum Splitter, kick some old school Egyptian beats. O sole God, decide who there is none. You create the earth according to your desire. You alone. People, all large and small animals, all things which are on earth, which walk on legs, which rise up and fly with their wings. The foreign lands of Syria and Nubia, and the land of Egypt. The lord of every land who rises for them, the Aten of daytime, whose awesomeness is great. All distant countries, you make their life. O you who gives life to the son in his mother's womb, and calms him by stopping his tears. Nurse in the womb gives breath to enliven all he makes. Yeah! Thanks again for joining me via Zoom, DJ Bum Splitter. I'm sure they'll take off the ankle bracelets soon, and when they do, I owe you a 4-pack of Boyka, which you can pick up if you ever decide to visit New Zealand, and if New Zealand Customs ever decide to let a recidivist criminal like you in the country. So as you can tell, our boy Bum Splitter is wearing an ankle bracelet at the moment, and it's a really funny story. So one day, DJ Bum Splitter's just loafing around his house, smoking a joint, and he gets really high and decides to visit his grandma, who he hasn't seen in a while. He was too high to remember what his grandma's house looked like, so he walked into a derelict old warehouse, assuming it was his grandma's house. When he walked in, he saw a man with his pants around his ankles, getting absolutely smashed in the bum by a donkey. There was a crowd of dudes just standing around, whistling and cheering, and at that point, the warehouse got raided by the policia. DJ Bum Splitter tried to tell them he thought it was his grandma's house, but they weren't buying it. Luckily, he managed to bribe the judge with 85 Nicaraguan Cordoba, which is about $3.50 in New Zealand dollars, and he got off with home detention. So there you go. Another good man walks into a donkey show and gets taken down on a technicality. And back to the main story. We've got no idea what caused it, but around the 4th or 5th year of his reign, a dramatic shift was about to take place. A theory from Professor James K. Hoffmeyer, a professor of Old Testament and ancient Near Eastern history and archaeology at Trinity International University in Illinois. Fuck, that was a mouthful. That's what she said. Oh! So anyway, Professor Hoffmeyer's theory is that the pharaoh may have experienced a dream or divine vision sometime early in his reign, where he believed the Aten spoke to him. His idea of the sole god of the Aten may have started gradually and taken many years to crystallize. It may also have been suggested as a strategy of religious reform by his mother Tai. There was no exact motive known, but it could also have been a strategy to curb the power of the priesthood of Amun-Ra. Besides the pharaoh, they were the most powerful force in the land at the time, and the pharaoh could have considered them a threat. I should also mention that Professor Hoffmeyer works at an evangelical Christian university, which gave me a little pause about the source material. So I double-checked the information, verified it alongside other contemporary sources, and thankfully it holds up. Always do your research, kiddies. So during the 4th or 5th year of his reign, Amenhotep IV rechristened himself as Akhenaten, which translates to he who is effective on the Aten's behalf. The newly christened pharaoh Akhenaten now declared that the Aten would be the sole god of Egypt. But strangely enough, for a guy who was trying to establish a new theology, the only people actually allowed to worship the Aten were the pharaoh himself and Queen Nefertiti with her sweet Nefertitties. Aten meant circle or disc, and was related to the idea of creation and continued existence, providing life and energy to all it watched over. The Aten first appeared as a god in texts from the 12th dynasty, and as previously mentioned, Amenhotep III did establish an independent cult of the Aten, and although he took the Aten for his personal deity, it was never to the exclusion of the other gods. But it wasn't enough to proclaim the Aten as the sole god. Under the direction of Akhenaten, images of Amun and all the other gods needed to be expunged. And it should also be mentioned at this point that names were very important to the Egyptians. It was thought that to know the true name of a thing was to have power over it. If your name continued to be spoken after your death, you would live on in the afterlife. And conversely, having nobody ever speak your name again was to be condemned to obliteration. And as such, many pharaohs had funerary cults which sprung up after their death, so that their names would continue to be spoken. And so, having the names and images of the gods erased from all the official writings would also condemn them to oblivion. Many existing temples or religious monuments were also desecrated or outright destroyed. A priest and historian named Manetho from the Ptolemaic kingdom wrote, "Not only did the pharaoh's men set towns and villages on fire, pillaging the temples and mutilating images of the gods without restraint, but they also made a practice of using the sanctuaries as kitchens to roast the sacred animals which people worshipped. And they would compel the priests and prophets to sacrifice and butcher the beasts, afterwards casting the men forth naked." And strangely enough, all images and depictions of the Aten, besides the raid solar disk, were also banned. But Akhenaten wasn't done yet. No siree, Bob. Around the 5th or 6th year of his reign, the religious capital of Thebes was abandoned. Akhenaten struck out into the wilderness, and in the middle of bumfuck nowhere, decided to build the new capital, Akhetaten, also known as Amarna, which translated as the horizon of the Aten. The location was chosen because the cliffs that framed the new city resembled the ark's symbol, meaning horizon. The city was built quickly using the smaller talatat blocks, and it was not designed with the comfort or interests of anybody but the royal family in mind. Suffice to say, only temples of the Aten were allowed to be built, with the largest being the Temple of Gemet Pa Aten. Wide avenues ran down the middle of the city, through which Akhenaten and Nefertiti would ride their chariot every morning. A boundary stone from the city has an inscription reading, "Look, Aten! The Aten wishes to have something made for him as a monument, namely Akhetaten. It is Aten, my father, who advised me concerning it, so it could be made for him as Akhetaten." It was also around this time that the official art style of ancient Egypt was radically changed. For centuries, the official style had been refined and codified, to a point where it had almost become a paint-by-numbers affair. The new style, known as the Amarna style, broke from the traditional style by having a sense of movement and activity in the images. The human figures had raised heads and would often overlap to form crowded, busy scenes. The human form, and most particularly the image of Akhenaten himself, was portrayed much differently. Human forms were often slender with exaggerated features. Akhenaten himself took on a particularly androgynous look, being displayed with large hips, a larger stomach and thighs, and a big old pair of man-titties. He was also depicted with a protruding chin, an elongated skull, and a full pair of gigantic lips. As we have never definitively found his mummy, we're not sure if this is what he looked like in real life, but most certainly it was the way he wanted to be depicted. Alwyn L. Burridge from Toronto University put forth a theory that Akhenaten may have suffered from Marfan syndrome. Those with Marfan syndrome often have slender bones, a long face, an elongated skull, spidery fingers, and a wide pelvis. Some historical figures also speculated to have Marfans include Abraham Lincoln, violinist Niccolo Paganini, and pioneering blues musician Robert Johnson. And oddly enough, one person confirmed to have it was none other than Joey Ramone of the Ramones. However, this may be unlikely in Akhenaten's case. If Akhenaten had Marfans, he would have had a weakened cardiovascular system and could possibly have gone blind in adulthood. With such wide hips, it would have also been difficult for him to father children, but we know this wasn't the case, as Nefertiti's hungry vajayjay squeezed every last drop of penis juice out of him, leaving him shooting dust. Not only was Akhenaten very devoted to his wife Nefertiti, but he was also very devoted to his 6 daughters, Meritaten, Meketaten, Ankesenpa Aten, Neferneferu Aten Tashiret, Neferneferu and Setenpere. And if my friend Leash is listening, any of those names would be excellent for your soon-to-be-born daughter. Very uncharacteristically for the time, a lot of art was devoted to depicting them, in much the same way as other pharaohs had depicted their sons. But it wasn't all sunshine, smiles, and scarabs in Akhenaten's kingdom. The priesthood of Amun suffered greatly under Akhenaten's religious reforms. The closure of the temples also had a rippling economic effect. The harvesting and processing of papyrus depended largely on the temples, as did the industries of amulet makers, jewelers, weavers, butchers, bakers, candlestick makers, risk takers, and ball breakers, all of whom suffered financially with the closure of the temples. Egyptian foreign policy also suffered greatly, as many foreign rulers, leaders, and appeals for help went unanswered. The king of Byblos, King Radabi, sent over 50 letters to Akhenaten asking for help fighting off the Abdi Shirta of Amurru, all of which went unanswered. The king of Mitanni, Tushratta, went full-on Karen on him. He complained that while his father, Amenhotep III, had sent him gold statues, Akhenaten only sent gold-plated statues. My God, what a monster! That said, it's entirely possible that Nefertiti may have stepped up to take up some of the administrative slack, while Akhenaten was preoccupied with religious rituals. Much to the displeasure of literally everybody else, the cult of the Aten persisted as the state religion for around 20 years. And while the cosmology of the cult of the Aten is well established, there are no records of any kind of moral prescripts, nor instructions for any rituals. And because only Akhenaten and Nefertiti were actually allowed to worship the Aten, everybody else had to worship Akhenaten, who theoretically would intercede to the Aten on their behalf. And despite every attempt to obliterate the traditional religions of Egypt, many people still practice them in secret, praying and leaving offerings for the return of the old gods. It should also be mentioned that unlike other civilizations of the era, the Egyptian religion was not dependent on any kind of blood sacrifice. For example, if you wanted something from the jackal-headed god Anubis, you would go to the temple of Anubis and leave an offering, such as a sixer of beer and a pack of smokes. The Egyptians took pride in the fact they worshipped civilized just gods, as opposed to blood-crazed monsters from other civilizations. No records of traditional offerings to the Aten have been recorded, so we've got no idea what brand of beer or smokes he would have preferred. Later in Akhenaten's reign, a major pandemic spread through the Mesopotamian lands. The lives of many royal family members and high-ranking officials were claimed, which contributed to the decline of Akhenaten's government. Although we have no record of exactly when or how he died, Akhenaten was thought to have died during the 20th year of his reign. In the song Cast Down the Heretic, from their fourth album, Annihilation of the Wicked, technical death metal band Nile put forth a theory about Akhenaten's death. They put forth the idea that Akhenaten's death may have come at the hands of others. His killers may have wanted to restore the old gods and the traditional way of life. Akhenaten's death was thought to be so horrific and brutal that from then on, no future ruler or conquering power would even dare to fuck with the traditional Egyptian religion, which remained intact right up until those damn Christians decided to burn the Library of Alexandria. Of course, this is all just speculation on the part of Carl Sanders and co., but as the song has an absolutely bitchin' lead guitar trade-off, which culminates in an amazing harmonized motif, I've got to give a little weight to it. Outside of the royal family and a handful of priests, the cult of the Aten lacked many devoted followers and would soon collapse after the pharaoh's death. And while its collapse did indeed begin with his death, the cult of the Aten still needed to be exorcised. His daughters, whose names contained Aten, were renamed with Amun, and his son Tutankhaten became Tutankhamen. Very little is known about Akhenaten's successor, Smenkhare. Some historians believe Smenkhare could have been Akhenaten's co-regent and husband to his daughter Meritaten. He also could have been another of Akhenaten's sons, born to an unknown mother. With his androgynous appearance and the homophobia that we're still desperately trying to get rid of to this day, Smenkhare was also suspected to be Akhenaten's gay lover. Although Smenkhare began a half-assed effort to restore the old gods, it never gained much traction as he only reigned for a year. Upon the death of Smenkhare, the throne was passed to Akhenaten's 9-year-old son, the boy king now named Tutankhamun. As he was only 9 years old, Tutankhamun was more or less a puppet for his vizier, a man named Ai, who was Nefertiti's father. Under Tutankhamun's reign, the restoration of the old gods started to gain some momentum, and would be continued 9 years later upon his death when the throne passed to the vizier Ai. As previously mentioned, pharaohs who died would usually have funerary cults, who would worship the deified dead pharaoh. With all the upheaval of Akhenaten's reign, Tutankhamun was one of the only pharaohs to have had a funerary cult during this period. Ai only reigned as pharaoh for 4 years. As he was an old man with no ears who snorted fat lines of Metamucil every morning, he passed the throne to Egypt's highest-ranking general, a man named Horemheb, who had been born a commoner. Under Horemheb's reign, worship and restoration of the old gods was made official. Akhenaten was formally considered, as the Romans said, damnatio memoriae, which roughly translates to condemnation of memory, in which all records and mention of a person are erased from existence, essentially condemning Akhenaten's soul to oblivion. All temples to the Aten were destroyed, and all building materials were recycled to build new projects, including temples to Amun. Damnatio memoriae was practiced in Egypt through a ritual known as execration texts, which are also covered in song by Nile on the second track of their third album, In Their Darkened Shrines, on the imaginatively named yet nonetheless face-ripping song Execration Text. The name of the person to be damnatioed was written on a piece of clay and ritualistically smashed. As an old man himself with no ears to pass the throne onto, Horemheb passed the throne onto his vizier and military buddy, a man named Ramses. Ramses already had a son named Seti and a grandson named Ramses II, and thus had a stable dynasty to leave the throne to, and with that, the 19th dynasty began. Ramses I only reigned very briefly for a few years, but under the reign of his son Seti I, all territory that had been lost during Akhenaten's reign was restored. The borders and streams of revenue were secured once again, and Egypt was about to enter a new golden age. Seti I ordered that Akhenaten's name, as well as that of Smenkhare, Tutankhamun, and Ai, be removed from the official lists of pharaohs, thus making it look like succession had passed from Amenhotep III straight to Horemheb, who was allowed to remain on the official lists due to his efforts at restoration. And as this is a case where the Egyptians deliberately tried to erase all evidence of Akhenaten, it's amazing that we have as much evidence as we do. A further discovery would be made 200 years later. Egyptian workers who were constructing the tomb of Ramses IX accidentally uncovered the tomb of Queen Tai, known to Egyptologists as KV55. In his 2019 book, Akhenaten, Egypt's False Prophet, Nicholas Reeves writes, "The mummy of Queen Tai was removed, possibly to separate her from her heretic son. There remained one unidentified sarcophagus and mummy, speculated to be that of Akhenaten. This particular sarcophagus suffered a very violent desecration. All names were erased, and identifying facial features, such as the eyes, nose, and mouth, were torn away, effectively denying the deceased king's spirit sight, ear, and sustenance. And although I could find very little information about it, Believe it or not, Artenism still exists in one form or another today. The reconstructed religion combines ancient and modern practices. The Akhenaten Fellowship was founded in 2001, although I could find very little evidence regarding their theology, rituals, doctrines, or moral prescriptions. And with that, the heretic pharaoh turns to dust, and his soul fades into the burning pits of the Duat. Damn, that was a long one. I didn't even know this one was going to be a two-parter until I started recording it. And to tell you the truth, I'm bloody buggered after all that. I'm going to go take a nap. But if you were thinking of becoming a patron, now would be a really great time. Because on Thursday, I'm going to be dropping the first bona fide super special bonus episode, just for all you patrons. It's a hell of a story, but if you want to hear it, you gotta pay like everybody else. So give me that sweet, sweet $2 a month. If you can't stretch to that much, I still got you covered like a Jimmy hat, homie. The next regular episode is gonna drop on Monday, and it's all about a very famous intellectual from history who decided to go ahead and start his own cult. Because why not? Everybody else was doing it, so why couldn't he? But until then, I just want to thank each and every one of you fellow archivists for slogging it out in this first two-parter, which I'm sure won't be the last. So until next time, this is John and Shadow, signing off and signing out for another episode. See all you folks next time.